Right, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another Training for Hiking Q&A. My name is Rowan Smith. I am the founder of Summit Strength, and I specialize in helping hikers and mountaineers get fit, strong, and resilient for their adventures. Now, essentially, what this stream is all about is we are talking training for hiking. And essentially this is an open Q&A around training for hiking. So if you have any questions that you're curious about, anything you need a hand with, any subjects you're interested in learning about, you can basically post up in the chat and I'm more than happy to help. Now, in between those questions, I do have a couple of pre-prepared ones, which have been either come up over the last few days or it's been sent through to me, which I'll sort of cover. And then on top of that, in between all of that, I'm going to be doing some live course creation where essentially I'll be working through a little bit of creation of a brand new course for hikers, which is all about respiratory muscle training for hikers, which is essentially strength training for your breathing muscles. And I'm going to give you a bit of an inside look as we dive into this and as we explore, as I put together this course. So for anyone watching live, if you do have any particular questions you'd like me to cover, feel free to put in the chat. I'll pick them up when I'm in between questions and I will sort of answer them as best as I can. And it can be any topic around training, any topic around hiking. And if it's something that I can help you with, go right ahead. But with that being said, while we're waiting for any questions to kind of come through, I've got a couple of pre-prepared questions which I want to cover. Breathing strategies when training for hiking. This is a question and this is a topic which is very, 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 very big in the world of hiking. And essentially what this is inspired from is the question someone sent through. They said, look, I know that you talk about nose breathing a lot. And I find when I'm doing some higher intensity training, I really, really struggle to stick with this nose breathing. Like, is this a problem? And should I be doing something a little bit different? And this is a really, really interesting question. There's a few different layers into it because nose breathing is a topic which is really, really popular in the world of hiking, really, really popular in the world of training at the moment. And it's something you'll see a lot. And where I typically recommend nose breathing for, and the reasons I recommend nose breathing for, is a little bit different to some other things you may find online. So I want to talk you through my context on this particular topic and kind of where it falls into things. So the problem here is I often recommend my hikers focus on nose breathing during certain workouts. You'll often see me online saying, hey, I want you to do this workout, and while you're doing this workout, focus on nose breathing. Common situations for this is I'll often say, hey, when you go out and hike, try to do this as much as you can. When you're doing load of pack sessions, try to do this as much as you can. If you're climbing up a stair or a hill, try to maintain this nose breathing as much as you can. And you often see me talk about this. And when I'm talking about nose breathing, it's essentially breathing in and out through your nose. So keeping your mouth closed, in and out through your nose. Now, the tricky thing with this is when it comes down to this whole subject around nose breathing, there are many, many, many people out there who talk about nose breathing and they kind of talk about it in the sense it's almost this magical thing. There's a few sort of big names in the world of breathing training in the fitness industry who use nose breathing as one of their core concepts. And they'll often sort of say, hey, we recommend nose breathing because of these 10 different reasons. Because it does this, it does this, it does this, it does this, it does this. I've literally even seen people sort of say, hey, if you don't nose breathe, you are probably going to die soon. Like, logically, a bit crazy to say that, but I have seen people sort of say that and also insinuate a lot. And a lot of the stuff you'll often see when it comes down to this is a lot of those sort of like list 10 listed benefits of nose breathing. A lot of the stuff is debatable. There may be really good benefits to it. There may be not, but it's probably not as big as it's hyped up to be. There probably are some cool benefits to nose breathing, but that's not really the reason why I talk about it and the why I recommend it to my hikers and the reason why I advocate for it in certain situations. The reason why I like nose breathing is because it's a natural rate limiter. So what I mean by that is to be the most efficient on the trail. So when you're hiking along, to be the most efficient for your energy and for your fuel, so you can stay sustained with energy for long and not burn through as much energy that you get to fatigue, we essentially want to be relying on our aerobic energy system as much as we can. Now, our aerobic energy system is designed to provide fuel for long periods of time, but the tricky thing with this energy system is it's pretty slow. So it's essentially designed for low intensity exercise for long periods of time, but it's very, very, very efficient. Now, on the flip side of things, if we're trying to stay as efficient as we can, we want to rely on this aerobic energy system as much as we can while hiking, and we don't want to try to push our intensities where we rely on our anaerobic energy systems too much. So our anaerobic energy systems are the flip side of our aerobic, and essentially our anaerobic energy systems are responsible for providing energy when we need it quick. It's responsible for providing energy when we're working at higher intensities. And it's designed to be quick and it's designed to really, really get you in, give you energy when you need it. The drawback of these energy systems is they are not quite as efficient when it comes down to energy production as the aerobic energy system. So they essentially sacrifice efficiency for extra speed. Now, when it comes down to the hiking context, one thing that a lot of hikers struggle with their hiking and also some of their training sessions is they struggle with their pacing. And essentially what they end up doing is they end up hiking or walking at paces which is just a little bit too quick. In the hiking context, it's maybe a little bit too quick just purely for that energy efficiency. So they're pushing the speeds to the stage where they're working on that, they're using those anaerobic energy systems a little bit more. Or in the training context, maybe they're just pushing a little bit too quick, where they're actually training the anaerobic energy systems as opposed to aerobic. So that's a pretty important distinction. Now, when it comes down back to nose breathing and what we're talking about today, is ultimately if you stick to a nose breathing pace where you're constantly breathing in and out through the nose, you can manage that and you can maintain that. What this is going to do, it is naturally going to ensure that you're predominantly using your aerobic energy system. Because if you go quicker and you can't maintain that and you start getting huffed and puffed, well, it gives you a clear sign saying, hey, if I'm getting out of breath, I probably need to pull things a little bit slower. And if we can pull things slower and stick to this, this means you're going to be working aerobically predominantly. So ultimately, if you can stick to nose breathing pace in certain situations, this is naturally going to slow you down and it is going to be an efficient pace. Now, the other way of looking at this is if you use, say, a heart rate monitor, you can also use the judge of zone 2, in the sense if you're working in your zone 2, that can pretty much be the same judge. But for most people, I don't really like heart rate monitors just purely for the fact I don't like numbers all the time. So nose breathing is a really, really good situation, a really good measure of efficiency. So while there may be some other benefits to it, that's not why I recommend it. I recommend it because it is a rate limiter and it's a judge of pace. So ultimately, using this nose breathing pace can be a really good tool for our lower intensity workouts, our hiking, our loaded pack walking. If we're trying to keep our stairs or hills a little bit lower intensity, this can be really, really good. Now, on the flip side of things, if people are trying to do this during a higher intensity workout, if you're going out and doing interval training, if you're doing stair and hills and you're trying to push the pace or whatever it may be, you will realize pretty quickly that this nose breathing is almost impossible to sustain. So you have two options in that situation. You're going really quick, you realize you can't do that nose breathing. You will either have to change to mouth breathing, so breathing in and out through the mouth, or you'll have to reduce your pace so you can maintain this. Now, if we're looking at a high intensity session, we probably don't really want to fall into the trap of having to reduce our pace to concentrate on nose breathing, because that kind of defeats the purpose. So this is kind of the conundrum a lot of people fall into. Realistically, the solution for this is just to be very, very, very clear. You do not have to be nose breathing all the time. Yes, there are people online who say you should be nose breathing all the time. It's the best thing in the world. Yes, there are people online who will sort of say if you're not nose breathing, it's not going to be efficient. Yes, there are people online who say this all the time, but they're kind of missing the bigger picture. Realistically, when it comes down to training for hiking, low and potentially moderate intensity workouts, nose breathing can be good. If you are trying to manage your pace, manage your intensity, and work yourself aerobically, nose breathing is probably going to be good. So if you're hiking, if you're low pack walking, maybe for your stair and hill climbing, if you're trying to keep that nice and low intensity, or whatever it may be. But if you're going to those higher intensity workouts, if you're doing interval training, if you're doing HIIT training, if you're doing quick stair and hill climbing where you're trying to push the pace, or whatever it may be, don't worry about nose breathing. Just breathe however you want. because naturally the nose breathing will not be doable at those higher intensities. As the saying goes, don't miss the forest for the trees. In the sense of with this high intensity training, your intention for those workouts is to get into those workouts and work hard. Your intention is to go and push yourself, challenge your energy systems, challenge your fitness in certain ways. And if you get hung up in using nose breathing in these situations and you end up having to reduce your pace, that's going to kind of defeat the purpose. Yes, it may turn into a breathing session, but it's not going to be a great high intensity session. So, long story short, nose breathing can be good in certain situations, but it doesn't have to be done all the time. It's not a problem if you fall into mouth breathing in your higher intensity stuff, and all of this. Last thing I'll sort of say on this subject is I'm talking about nose breathing a lot here. A lot of people maybe listen to this and be like, okay, Rowan, this sounds pretty good. And I like the idea of a rate limiter. I like the idea of holding back my workout so I work the right areas of fitness, but I really struggle to breathe through my nose. Maybe I've got small nostrils. Maybe I've got a deviated septum. Maybe I'm in the middle of winter and it's really, really cold or something like that. And if you're in this situation, totally fine. As I said before, this nose breathing is not magic. We're using it as a rate limiter. So if you struggle with your nose, the other option is basically training or walking or exercising at a conversational pace, where a pace where you can happily carry a conversation without getting too huffed and puffed in between words. So in the situation, if you ever see me talk about nose breathing and you're someone who struggles with your nose, use that option. Conversational pace works out pretty well. All right. So hopefully that just gives a little extra context in regards to fresh page. Yeah, it gives a little extra context in regards to this because the whole concept of nose breathing, so many people just take it way over the line, and you see so much stuff online in the fitness industry, also in the hiking industry, where people just kind of miss the forest for the trees, we said before. It's good, it's useful, it's not the be all end all. So keep that in mind. So with that being said, yeah, for anyone watching live, if you do have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. Happy to cover them, happy to help. But while that's going on, the next one I want to talk about is strength training for injury prevention. So strength training for injury prevention while hiking. Now, I talk all the time about pain and injury prevention for hikers. This is one of the big sort of pillars of my content in the sense that so many hikers out there struggle with these things, and so many hikers, if they could get on top of these things, feel more confident with these things, they would be very much happier on the trail. And when it comes down to this topic, while there is obviously, and to be very, very clear, there's never anything you can do to 100% guarantee that you can prevent an injury. So when we're talking about injury prevention, it's not a case of sort of saying, hey, we are 100% going to guarantee you will never get injured. No matter how fit, no matter how strong, no matter how well you trained, it's never going to be 100%. But there are definitely many things you can be doing in your training, in your life, in your hiking, which can reduce the risk of injury, reduce the risk of pain, and get yourself in a better chance of staying comfortable. Now, this is really, really, really relevant in the hiking community because injuries and pain are just so incredibly common in the hiking community. Just undiagnosed general foot pain, ankle pain, knee pain, hip pain, massive in the world of hikers. So many people struggle with all the different types of situations in this. So many hikers struggle with rolled and sprained ankles, step in a pothole or a loose rock, whatever it may be. So many hikers struggle with twisted knees if you take a slip or slide or step in something wrong. And a lot of people get in these situations where they just have a fall. You fall over, you have a tumble, or whatever it may be. And that can lead to shoulder issues, wrist issues, whatever it may be. There's so many things in the hiking community, reasons why we want to take this seriously. Because not only are these things bad enough, but if you say roll your ankle and you're 5 kilometers away from the trailhead, that's not much fun. If you break your ankle, even worse. So yeah, definitely not much fun. Now, when it comes down to this whole topic, if you follow my stuff for a while, there are many, many, many different things I often talk about when it comes to reducing the risk of pain or injury. I talk about conditioning, and I talk about mobility, and I talk about load management, and I talk about fatigue management, and so many different things that goes into the picture. But in amongst all that, one of the major things that I often try to push and I try to advocate for and really, really try to get hikers to focus on is strength training. And I say, look, one of the best things you can be doing to reduce the risk of pain or injury on the trail is doing structured and progressive strength training in your week. But probably 50% of the time when I'm talking about this type of stuff and I put up a post or a podcast or whatever it may be, I'll get a comment, I'll get an email, I'll get a private message or anything like that from some hiker out there who's doubtful, who's like, you know what are you talking about? It happens every single week. It's just like clockwork. And people will sort of say things like, hey, you know what? Actually, no, you're wrong. Strength training isn't what you should be doing. Or, you know what? You're wrong. You should actually just be stretching this area. Or, you know what? My massage therapist told me to do this. Or my physio told me to do this. Or my Pilates instructor told me to do this. Or, you know what? I didn't do any strength training and I got on top of this or whatever it may be. There's just everyone has their opinions around this. So today, I want to give you a little bit more context on this particular subject. Because when it comes down to me talking about training for hiking and talking about topics, the things I say, I'm not just pulling them out of nowhere. I'm not just making things up and just being like, hey, this sounds good. I'm going to talk about it today. Pretty much everything I say, and I would sort of say 99.9% of things I say, and that 0.01% is just stuff when I'm maybe a little bit emotionally charged and I just want to, say something to fire people up or stir things up or whatever it may be. But 99.9% of things I sort of say comes from, that is based off either scientific evidence in one way or another, clinical evidence in regards to stuff that people have seen evidence for. It's not a scientific study, but they actually apply this in real world and they've seen good evidence from it. Personal experience of like what I've tested and tried with my clients or my things, or just pure logic and sort of saying, okay, there's evidence to prove this, there's evidence to prove that. There's no evidence to prove in the middle, but we can kind of take logical steps to kind of get somewhere. Now, when it comes down to this type of stuff, again, if you follow my stuff for a while, you probably don't really often see me sort of talking about the scientific evidence side of things. You don't often see me saying, hey, I recently saw this study and it proved this. I recently saw this study and it proved this, or whatever it may be. I used to, like, if you look at my older stuff, like 5 or 6 years ago, I talked about this stuff a bit, but I don't really do a huge amount of it anymore. Because realistically, when it comes down to scientific evidence, the fitness industry as a whole is absolutely awful when it comes down to this type of thing. And you will often see people doing videos or blog posts or interviews or podcasts or whatever it may be. And people will sort of say, hey, the evidence shows that this is the best thing in the world, or the evidence shows that doesn't work. Or they'll do a video and say a recent study proved this, or based on scientific studies, or whatever it may be. And while in theory, the idea of using evidence-based training or science-based training is good, in reality, it gets a little bit tricky because a lot of the time when people are talking about this stuff and using this to get their point across, a lot of the time it's kind of smoke and mirrors in the sense that it is honestly, and one of the things that I would sort of say, I love what I do. I love my industry and I'm going to plan to do this for years and years and years until I retire. But as with everyone in their job, sometimes you have the bad days and you're like, oh my gosh, is this industry really for me? And 9 times out of 10, when I have that type of thought, it comes from the situation where I just get absolutely soul destroyed by seeing how many professionals misrepresent this type of thing. And they take evidence, they take scientific research or whatever it may be, and they will try to prove a point and they'll try to sell something or whatever it may be. But what they'll do is they'll either misrepresent the evidence or they'll flat out lie. And I see this and I'm like, oh my gosh, like where do you even start pulling this apart? Where do you even start changing people's mind? Like it just drives me mental. Like examples of this is like there's multiple big names out there where they'll put something on social media and they'll say this big claim and they'll say, hey, this is the best thing in the world, this is the worst thing in the world, whatever it may be. And then someone's like, well, where's your evidence? Like, what have you got to support this? And they'll provide a study and they'll say, hey, this study proves this. But then you go and actually read the study and it says completely different, or it doesn't say what the person was originally saying, or it's just completely a random study. And you're like, this person lied. They were called on it and they'll say, hey, give the evidence. Then they gave false evidence and they just assume no one would read it. And they just keep on week after week after week doing the same thing. It's like, oh, crazy. Or there's people out there, and I ran into this last year where I did a very, very, let's say, popular course that a lot of coaches are doing and a lot of people in the hiking community are doing, and I was upskilling in a particular area, and people sell these courses and they use science as evidence to justify what they're selling. But then you look up what they're actually quoting and you're like, well, this is like misrepresented. This isn't actually what the studies were saying. And then you start thinking, okay, there's this person who's selling these courses to coaches, and they're saying something which isn't true, or at least isn't backed up by evidence. They're telling these coaches this, then their coaches are going to go tell their clients this, and their clients are going to go tell their friends this, and there's just follow-on effect of just someone's just being dishonest at the top, and it's just trickling down. Like you can tell, it stirs me up a little bit. So honestly, I'm not a massive fan of talking about studies or scientific evidence and that. A lot of what I do is based off that in one way or another, but I don't talk about it. I don't use it as proof, whatever it may be. But with all that out of the way, and that was a rant in itself, today's a bit of an exception. Because when it comes down to strength training for injury prevention, back to the original subject, there's not just one study saying it's good. There's not just two or three or four or whatever it may be. There is an overwhelming amount of evidence to say this can be beneficial. And it's not even, there's just no debate on this that it can be. There's just so many studies out there. So what I want to use an example today is I want to use a review. Now, this is a review, and it took a bunch of different studies that it was looking at, and basically it reviewed those studies. So it wasn't just looking at one or two studies, but it basically, the whole point of it, looked at a bunch of studies, filtered into one, come to some conclusions. Now, if you want to look this up for yourself, it's called The Effectiveness of Exercise Interventions to Prevent Sports Injuries, a systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. Bit of a mouthful, we can type that in, it'll pop up. Essentially what this review looked at. It looked at a total of 25 different trials and different studies. So again, not just one or two, but 25 different things. Of these 25 studies combined, it had a total of over 2,600 participants. So 2,600. God, I can't do my numbers. I need another coffee. That many participants, my gosh, with over almost 3,500 injuries in total. So it was a massive population size out of all of these studies. Essentially what they looked at was the difference between injury prevention protocols. And they looked at stretching, they looked at proprioception, which is kind of like balance work, and they also looked at strength training. What they found was very, very interesting. They found out of all those studies, all those people, that stretching alone was not a significant factor for injury prevention. That in itself is worthy of discussion because so many people are in their head and they get told, okay, you have to warm up before exercise or it will cause injury. Or you have to cool down after exercise and it will cause injury. And you should be stretching or it will cause injury or whatever it may be. They found that stretching alone is not effective at injury prevention. Not to say stretching doesn't have benefits, not to say stretching can't be useful, not to say stretching can't be a part of an injury prevention program or pain prevention program, because that's not what we're looking at. But if you have an injury or if you're trying to prevent an injury and all you're doing is stretching, probably not going to be super effective. That's very, very, very important. And again, before you get up in arms and think about this, this isn't me saying it, this is a review of studies. Moving on. They also found proprioception work had some benefits, that some significant benefits, and proprioception work, balance work could be useful. But what they found was strength training by far had the strongest effect. And their conclusion coming out of looking at all of these studies, they basically said strength training, if done right, can reduce sport injuries, so like acute injuries like rolled ankles or torn hamstrings, stuff like that, can reduce sport injuries by less than 1/3. That's huge. So what they're saying is basically of all these people, if they had done strength training, they could potentially reduce 1/3 of those injuries, which is crazy. And they also reduced overuse injuries by almost half. So overuse injuries are just like general foot pain or general knee pain, shin splints, that type of stuff, where you're just doing lots and lots and lots, and that's leading to pain. That's a massive conclusion. And whether those numbers, it's not like, hey, if I do strength training, I'll have a 50% less chance to get an overuse injury. But as a whole, that's pretty significant. So looking at all of this, when I'm talking about strength training for pain and injury prevention, it's not just me making things up. It's not me just saying whatever I want. It is significant, and it is definitely something you should consider. Now, again, following up on this, this isn't to say that all strength training is equal. And if you just do a couple of exercises here and there, it can magically save you from injury or anything like that. But when we're looking at a structured and progressive strength training program, which works the right areas in a logical way, which progresses over time, which you do consistently, it can be an incredibly effective aid for your hiking journey. So if you're struggling with pain and injury and you haven't explored strength training before, maybe, hopefully, this gives you a little bit of extra emphasis to kind of get into it. So, with that being said, you can kind of got me all worked up in regards to talking about this sports science stuff. In all honesty, I have recorded 5 or 6 podcasts talking about that subject, and I just haven't released them because I found myself getting a bit fired up, and I just wanted to tear into people and tear into names in the industry about it. But I restrained myself. So I've recorded a podcast on this so many times over the last couple of years, and literally just never released them because I'm like, oh, I don't want to, yeah, really get too fired up and release something. But yeah, it's a really, really tricky thing. And as I said last year, I went through a very, very, very big course, which a lot of people you see online say they got trained by these people, and a lot of the evidence they provided was just debatable, to say the least. And it really broke my heart. And I was like, this sucks. So it's a tricky, tricky thing. But anyway, with all that being said, those are the questions I kind of had sent through for today. So if anyone watching live does have any questions, feel free to pop in the chat. I'm happy to answer them or whatever it may be. But as we're going through, those are the questions I've had sent over. So yeah, let's do a little bit of course creation. So yeah, for people who haven't come across this before, don't know what I'm doing, essentially the second half of these live streams is I'm going to be doing a bit of open course creation, where essentially I'm going to be putting together a new breathing training for hikers course. And in this course, we're specifically going to be talking about respiratory muscle training, which is essentially strength training for your breathing muscles, which I think is a super interesting area of training for hikers that has a lot of potential benefits. And I feel like not many people are talking about this. And of the people who are talking about this in the hiking community, they're not really, I don't know, talking about it well. Great words there, I don't know. But they're not really talking about it in a way that, like, again, going back to what I just said before, has evidence behind it. It's a little bit debatable about what some people are talking about. So what I want to do out of this course is just to put together something that explains this area of training, talks about it logically, talks about what it is, how we go about it, and how to get the best use out of it, so you can make your mind up whether you want to explore this or not. Now, this is going to be a free course. I'm not going to be charging money for it once it's eventually put together. But yeah, that's what we're going to be working on. So far, I'm just putting bits and pieces. It's still very early days in the course, but so far what we kind of worked through is we just talked a little bit last time about like my background and like where I'm coming from with this. We've broken like the breathing muscles around what actual muscles are we responsible for breathing and what actual muscles we're trying to improve. We talked a little bit about like principles of effective breathing training. So some kind of like first principles we kind of want to keep in mind when we're talking about this type of stuff. We did a little bit on like the rationale of respiratory muscle training. I think we're going to dive into that a little bit more today. We've dived into a bit of potential benefits of this, of like, God, spelling. This is awful. Of yeah, of this type of stuff. And as I said, there are a lot of cool potential benefits of this. It's like not proven 100%. It's not like this is definitely going to do it, but there's a lot of cool potential evidence around this, and specifically for high altitude hikers. Um, and yeah, and that's kind of what we got through so far. So essentially what we are going to be covering today is how can we improve respiratory muscle strength. So this is a little bit lopsided, like there's other bits and pieces we're kind of going to go through here, but as I was putting together, that's kind of the type of topic we're going to be breaking down today. How can we improve respiratory muscle strength? And we can plug it into here. And yeah, we'll just sort of like plug away and kind of go through things. So respiratory, let me write this down, then I'll cover it. Yeah, so kind of the theory behind respiratory muscle training, how we're actually improving the strength of the breathing muscles is it's pretty much like any other strength training in the sense that we have our muscles that have a certain level of strength, a certain level of capacity. Our body likes to stay comfortable. If we apply a stimulus to those muscles, and we apply a stimulus that makes those muscles uncomfortable, which fatigues them in a certain way, the muscles will be like, I didn't like that. So they will recover and they will adapt to be stronger. So next time they face that stimulus, they will be more comfortable. That's kind of like strength training in a nutshell. Essentially, respiratory muscle training is pretty much the same thing. We apply load. Those muscles are like get fatigued and they adapt over time. Bit by bit by bit, we continue on. So the first premise of improving respiratory muscle strength is we need to treat it like strength training. We need to apply load to these certain muscles. Now, when it comes down to when it comes down, let me copy this up. When it comes down to this type of thing, strength training can improve many, many different things in just traditional strength training. Many different aspects of improvement. Like strength training realistically can improve your muscle strength, it can improve your contractile speed, it can improve your endurance, and all of this stuff. There's a lot of different things we can get out of traditional strength training. Very, very similar respiratory muscle training can actually improve not just our strength, but of various different things. So we can improve our strength in our muscles, we can improve our endurance in our respiratory muscles, we can improve our speed of contraction, and power output. So they're four different things which we can actually improve on without respiratory muscle training. For all this respects, you probably don't need to like dive into all of this in too much detail, but realistically, all we need to know is strength. Improving this can improve a lot of different areas depending on how we train. Now, let me just copy this over. I think that's what we want. So the way I work this, I just pull rough notes and sort of things before the call, and then I just copy it up. Yeah. So let's copy this up. So essentially, yes, many, many different aspects of improvement. So realistically, the main, let's sort of say, recommendations for improving respiratory muscle strength requires moderate loads. So So yeah, so realistically, we don't have to dive into it too much detail, but similar with strength training, if we want to improve our muscular strength, we can't just go out and walk. If we're just doing walking, that's good for us in certain ways, but it's not enough of a stimulus to improve our strength. We need to apply resistance to the muscles through weights or dumbbells or barbells or pack or whatever it may be. Now, when it comes down to respiratory muscle training, of like looking at the available recommendations in regards to the evidence behind it, what has sort of been the typical recommendation is if we want to improve our respiratory muscle strength, we need to apply. The best way is to apply at least moderate loads, sustained to the limit of tolerance. So what that means is basically finding a load on our breathing muscles, which after about 30 breaths they begin to fatigue and we can't really do anymore. So when we're sort of working out like particularly percentages of numbers, they sort of say around about 50 to 60% of your 1RM. So your 1RM for your breathing would literally be if you applied resistance to your breathing muscles on the way in. And you've got a device, like a device, stuck it in your mouth, turned up a valve so there's a huge amount of resistance. So when you're breathing in, it's really, really difficult. Your 1RM, 100% of your 1RM would be if you could just do one breath in and then you literally couldn't do any more. That's super, super, super heavy. Essentially, the typical recommendations for this is finding about 50 to 60% of that. So the way that works is finding resistance that after about 30 breaths, we can't really do anymore. This has typically been shown to generate the widest range of benefits. So this is improving your strength However, it also improves your endurance. It also improves your speed of contraction. It also improves your power output. There are different methods of training your breathing muscles, which can hone in on endurance, but they're not quite as effective for strength. Or they can hone in on other things, but they're not quite effective for everything. This is kind of the catch-all approach. 50 to 60% of your 1RM. Now, what they've shown is, where are we? I wrote this down somewhere, or copied this down somewhere. More it loads. So what they've shown with this is basically when they've done a lot of studies, typically when you're doing a study and you're testing things, they will basically look at, okay, we're testing the thing we're trying to test. In this example, loading up your breathing muscles, see what that happens. And they'll also do a placebo. So essentially, we don't just want to do one thing, but we also want to test something that people think it's causing a change. They think they're training, whatever it may be, and they want to see if there's a placebo effect or not, even if there isn't quite enough stimulus, whatever it may be. So essentially, to put that into context, placebo used in studies. Basically, they've used typically. Oh, I copied the wrong thing. Oh, no, it's right there. Gosh, I'm losing my mind today. 15%. One RM. So what they've done in studies when they're using this placebo effect, they've actually used, okay, some people are going to go do 50 to 60% of the 1RM. That percentage that's sort of loaded up so much that after 30 breaths, I'm getting really fatigued. Then they've also got other people who are doing 15% of the 1RM. So they've basically either done 30 or up to 60 breaths at that lesser load. It feels like it's resistance. It feels like it's difficult, but it doesn't show significant changes. So what that says to us is if we do want to get improvements in this foot strength, we need to be targeted with this. We need to be specific because even if something feels difficult, and even if it feels like it's kind of working the breathing muscles, if we're not providing enough resistance, we're not providing enough load, probably not going to do anything. It'll feel like we're getting a workout, but it's probably not going to give the benefits we want. Now, this, and the reason why I'm taking so long to try and word this or whatever it may be, this is really, really, really important to be aware because there's a lot of people out there who talk about respiratory muscle training and they sort of see like, oh, cool, like there's some cool benefits for high altitude. It can potentially improve all these things. It can potentially help our endurance performance, all of this. They see respiratory muscle training like, cool, this is really, really good. And then they'll go to some source of information and they'll sort of look at, okay, here is a method of improving my respiratory muscle strength and they say this will help you, but it's probably not enough resistance. So typical examples of this that I often see. Where's my thing? Here we go. Yeah, so typical examples that we often see, and I see a lot of people like kind of talking about this type of stuff. Things which don't recommended. Is like nose breathing. Like I see people out there who breathing in and out through the nose, very, very popular in the world of endurance. We're talking about before on the live stream. Um, it can be a useful breathing strategy, but I have seen people who say nose breathing will improve your respiratory muscle strength. And yes, while if you doing nose breathing and you're working at hard exercise, it will feel difficult. By no means at all is that going to be enough resistance to improve that strength. If 15% of your 1RM isn't showing significant changes, breathing through your nose, definitely not. Even though people like to say this. The same thing is like one nostril breathing. So you'll see people kind of saying, okay, if nose breathing isn't so much, what you can do, close one nostril and then basically do a big breath in. And you will notice that, okay, that feels a little bit difficult. That feels a little bit challenging. You might be like, okay, cool, maybe I'm doing something good. But again, this is if 15% of our 1RM isn't showing significant changes, if we kind of want to hit about 50 to 60% of that 1RM, one nostril breathing, doing that 30 times, it's not going to do anything. It may make you feel all spaced out. It may make you feel great, like just psychologically. But when we're talking about respiratory muscle strength, it's probably not going to do anything. And Again, you may think I'm belaboring the point here, but I see people recommending this and say it's improving your breathing muscles and saying it will improve your attitude. And it's just a bit debatable. The other thing is like breathing through a straw. Same thing. People say just hold a straw and breathe in. Again, it's not resistance. It will make things feel difficult or whatever it may be. Breathing through your fist. I've seen people say, put your fist here, try to breathe through. It does give you a little bit of resistance and it does feel things, but it's not really going to do enough resistance. And the other thing is like weighted diaphragmatic breathing. So diaphragmatic breathing is like your belly breathing. Now, this is a principle or a basic breathing strategy, which a lot of hikers should be looking at. Because essentially, as we were talking about before with our breathing muscles, where are we? Um, yeah, our breathing muscles. Our primarily breathing muscles is our diaphragm and also some other around our intercostals or between our limbs. They're our main breathing muscles. We also have accessory breathing muscles, which are like our sternocleidomastoid and our scalenes, which are kind of up here. Some people, when we get really stressed out or we're working harder, whatever it may be, or just as a general thing, we'll kind of use those accessory breathing muscles more than we kind of should. And they get tired, they're not quite as efficient, whatever it may be. So, one good thing to practice and one primary breathing strategy is actually diaphragmatic breathing. Practicing using this diaphragm a little bit more, practicing breathing in, feeling the belly expand, getting that a little bit more natural. And that's kind of like the foundation of breathing strategy we sort of want to look at. And as we get into the course, we'll sort of like talk through this is the first step. We want to nail this before we start applying load and yada, yada, yada. And we often see people, again, do this type of diaphragmatic breathing where you lie down and you concentrate on breathing in and out with the belly, feeling the belly expand and in. And I've seen people out there who sort of said, hey, if we put a weight plate on our belly and we do this diaphragmatic breathing, this is going to improve our respiratory muscle strength. It may be a good cue, it may be useful in some other different reasons, but it's not going to be enough resistance to improve this. The same thing as like a belt. Like I've seen people like wear a resistance belt, and again, plainness will improve respiratory muscle strength. And again, it's just not enough resistance. So realistically, like this is going to be a massive part of the course, is because when we're getting into this, a lot of people, and this is one of the reasons why I talk about doing this course, is a lot of people at the top level, they're like, hey, respiratory muscle training can be useful. But then they start talking about all this stuff, which isn't really respiratory muscle training. It's not enough resistance. And it's kind of like me saying, hey, strength training is the best thing for your knees and yada, 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 yada. And then I start saying, okay, just go out and walk. And while walking may be useful, walking may be good, it's not the same thing. So that's very, very, very important. Now, on top of that, respiratory muscle training, main recommendation, required, blah, blah, blah. So then we got to talk about, so how can we actually load the muscles up? We typically need a respiratory training device. Now, these devices are basically stick in your mouth, you load things up. How do we want to go about this? We can sort of say, so probably the two most common things in regards to this, in regards to buying um, stuff which may help with this, is there's two different things. There's a respiratory muscle trainer. So like this thing here. This is a particular brand, which I'll do in another video, I'll talk through it. But basically what you do, put it in your mouth. There's resistance valves here. So basically it loads up your inhalation and also you can do your exhalation. There's lots of different brands out there, but this is typically the main thing that I'll sort of talk about. Because you can load it up. It's like putting a dumbbell on your breathing muscles. Works out pretty well. Now, there is another thing we can use, and you'll often see floating around. It's like one of these things. And they're kind of like they call them like an elevation mask or an altitude mask or a respiratory training mask. And I could talk about this for hours. Like these things do not replicate high altitude. I wouldn't call them an elevation mask, but essentially what they can act as a breathing trainer, and they can apply load to your breathing muscles. Now, with this, I'm not really talking about this super logical order today, but we'll see how we can kind of break this down. Is um, where during exercise applies load to breathing muscles. While the systems optimize training load. Actually, let's do this. Let's do pros and cons. We'll do overview, pros, cons. Maybe that's a better way of doing this. A mask where during exercise applies resistance to inhalation. Pros to this, I don't know, adjustable, applies resistance, covers mouth and nose. There we go. Cons to this, probably not enough resistance for the load. Have to wear during exercise. Makes things difficult, makes things more. Yeah, and so in future, like when we actually get to the course, I'll probably break this down in a bit more detail. Maybe I'll get some evidence or whatever it may be. Maybe I'll just talk about this. But these respiratory training masks, you see them everywhere. They're very, very popular. A lot of people kind of talk about them. And essentially what you do is you pop them on and you go out and do exercise, whether you go for a run or a bike ride or whatever it may be. Now, the idea behind this is they've got these little adjustable valves where you can apply different levels of resistance to your breathing. So when we're looking at the breathing respiratory muscle training context, applying resistance to the muscles, that's a good thing. That's definitely applying way more resistance than nose breathing. Definitely applying way more resistance than a straw or one nostril breathing or weighted diaphragmatic breathing. Because if you do this, you'll notice that like, oh my gosh, like it's tough and it's difficult. So the pros to this, it does have a bit of an adjustable resistance, so you can make things a little bit more difficult, a little bit more difficult, which is very important for strength training because we need progressive overload. As we get stronger, we need to apply more load. It applies resistance, and also there's a potential benefit is basically it covers your nose and your mouth. So basically your whole thing. So what that can do for you is it can let you do nose breathing while doing this type of stuff, which I wouldn't sort of say is essential, but some people like to, when we're training, we like to use nose breathing as a rate of measure. And sometimes doing this type of stuff while nose breathing can make your nose breathing on sea level a little bit easier. Kind of pro. It's not really massively needed, but it is an area. Now, the cons of this type of stuff is realistically, when we're looking at the evidence, probably the optimal training load is about 50 to 60% of your 1RM. So something that will fatigue you after about 30 breaths. Realistically, this isn't going to apply enough load for you to fatigue after 30 breaths. It's probably not going to happen. However, there is some sort of studies that show that, like, look, wearing this during exercise, it can improve your respiratory muscle endurance, a little bit of strength. So I wouldn't say it's the optimal training load, but there is some evidence to say it can improve things. However, the big drawback to this, and so it's probably not optimal, but probably the biggest drawback to these types of things is you have to wear junior sessions. So ultimately, it does make your exercises and your training way more difficult. This may not sound like a bad thing, but we can sort of look at, okay, if we're a hiker and we're trying to improve our aerobic energy system and we're trying to improve our aerobic fitness, we typically want to keep our intensity relatively low. And if we're going out on our hikes or going out on loaded pack walks or going out on low intensity sessions, we're wearing a mask. If we push the intensity a little bit too much because the mask will make things a little bit more difficult, this may push that workout out of our particular main priority of improving our aerobic energy system may shift a little bit. Also, on top of that, if you're using this for high intensity stuff, so say, hey, we are doing interval training, which a lot of people do with this, and you'll go quick for a minute and rest for a minute or whatever it may be. The main priority for interval training for a hiker is we want to work hard, we want to push the intensity, we want to actually go really, really quick. But if we're wearing that breathing mask, it may give us a good breathing workout, but it probably will limit our ability to push fast. So maybe we're getting a drawback somewhere else. So you're running the balance between, is this going to be a breathing workout or is this going to be something that's working out other things? can be a bit tricky. On top of that, it just makes things way more uncomfortable. A lot of people will do this and like, oh my gosh, to do this for 30 minutes or 40 minutes sucks. It gets sweaty, it gets uncomfortable. You don't have a good session. For a lot of people, it's just hard enough being consistent in normal sessions. And then you sort of think, I've got to do this for 30 minutes. You're like, oh, so that is definitely a con there. So these things that can be beneficial, they can potentially work, but they're probably not optimal and they do have a couple of big drawbacks. Now, on the flip side of things, these respiratory muscle devices, what are they called? Um, yeah, respiratory muscle devices. We can do overview, pros, cons. Overview, a specific device you wear, you put in your mouth to load up muscles, applies resistance to inhalation. Very, very simple. That's kind of what we're doing. We get this device, stick it in our mouth, breathe in, very, very difficult, or much more difficult. The pros, adjustable, can load up the breathing muscles appropriately. Do this separate through exercise. And then the cons. So yeah, so the respiratory muscle devices, let's sort of talk about them. So as I said, a specific device you're basically putting in your mouth to load up those breathing muscles. What they do, and they are designed, one thing, to apply resistance to your breathing. In this context, we're talking about inhalation. You can also apply resistance to your exhalation, but inspiratory muscle training is kind of what we're doing here. Now, the pros to this is basically can load up the breathing muscles appropriately. So these are literally designed to load up the breathing muscles in a way which is going to hit these guidelines. They are designed for that. You can go even heavier than this. You can do it to a point where you can fatigue in 10 breaths or whatever it may be. Probably don't need to do that, but they can load up the muscles. They're also adjustable. So all of them, or most of them, will have adjustable valves. So as you get stronger, you can make things more difficult. And then on top of that, a big, big, big pro to these types of things is you're not using these during your exercise sessions. You're not using these while you're on a bike or while you're running or while you're walking, whatever it may be. We're not running the risk of cannibalizing those sessions, but these are used separate. And the beauty of these things is if you're loading them up to that appropriate guideline, the typical recommendation for this is do it at a resistance where after 30 breaths, you are fatigued. You can't really do any more. So that takes about 3 minutes of your time. And most studies will sort of show, hey, you can either do this like once a day, 3 minutes, 30 breaths once a day. I think the optimal recommendation is doing it 5 days a week, 5 to 6 days a week, twice a day. So 3 minutes in the morning, 3 minutes in the evening. That's pretty time efficient, realistically. And I think that's a big, big, big pro. Now, the cons of this is basically price. Like these things will cost you a little bit of money. Let's sort of say AeroFit. Sorry if you just went from black screen to white screen, but yeah. So AeroFit, let's look at Power Breathe. So these are two of the big brands. Like AeroFit's the one I'm waving around that I quite like. And because they got a cool app and I really do like it. Essentially, where's their pricing? Compare trainers. So when you're looking at like an AeroFit device, the prices on. They will cost you a little bit of money. So if you're getting like one of the cheaper ones, it'll cost you like $100 or something like that. If you get one of the more expensive ones, which has a bunch of added extras and has extra like support and that, it'll cost you like $550. So definitely a lot of money. It is an investment, and this is something that's a little bit tricky. And there's a cheap one about $200. So it definitely does cost you a bit of money. Power Breathe is another one. I think they have a few more range of devices. Let's sort of say shop products. And they'll sort of have ones, breathing trainers. Let's say it's a few classic. So like £33, you can probably get like one. I don't think this has an adjustable resistance, but that's like what, 60 Australian dollars, something like that. All the way up to ones which are again similar price to that AeroFit. So And this type of stuff, it does cost you a little bit of money. But essentially, it's kind of like buying a set of dumbbells. Like it is there for a reason, and that is a limiter for a lot of people. They might be like, hey, I don't want to pay this. And then also another con of these is intention. Like if you are loading up something for 30 breaths and fatigue. It's not like something you're just going to do on the couch and not really pay attention to. It is something that does require a little bit of effort, a little bit of attention, and you have to roll in and actually like, you know what, I'm going to do this session properly. I'm going to pay attention to these 3 minutes, put a bit of effort into. So if you're really, really struggling with energy, if you're really, really struggling with this and that, may not really fit into your day. And I know when I've been going through training periods, I'm like, hey, I really want to do this type of training to help me. But you know what? I'm actually training really hard and I'm really low on energy. And the last thing I want to do is this at the end of the day. So that can be a little bit tricky. So, so yeah, so that's kind of, I'll definitely have to build this stuff out a little bit more when we get into the course, but we'll definitely sort of talk through this and make this a little bit more logical. But in a nutshell, respiratory muscle strength, we need to load up the muscles. There's a bunch of different things we can improve. The best way to go about this is applying moderate loads, so something that will take about 30 reps before we start to fatigue. Um, it has been shown that even in place things that have used a bit of load and it feels like resistance, if it hasn't had enough load, it won't show significant changes. Very, very important. So, commonly recommended things, a lot of this stuff, it may be beneficial for one reason or another, but we probably couldn't really classify that as respiratory muscle training. And if we are actually looking at loading up the muscles, we can either look at a mask, which can work, but maybe might not be optimal and does have a couple of drawbacks, or we can look at a respiratory muscle device, which definitely does what we're wanting here, but has that drawback of price. So, there we go. So I think that'll probably do us for today. I'm losing my voice, only a few minutes left, so that's all good. So yeah, today was yeah, that definitely does need to be built out a little bit more and get a little bit more logical and maybe a bit more built out. But hopefully that makes sense. So with that being said, for anyone who's watching right now or anyone watching in the future, I hope you've enjoyed this today. Hope you got a little bit out of it. As I sort of said, with the nose breathing stuff and the science stuff and all of that, yeah, any questions of any of that stuff, please let me know. But hopefully that all makes sense. And if anyone is curious about any topics for future presentations or future streams, feel free to send them over. I'm happy to cover them. But with that being said, thank you for listening. Hope you've enjoyed it. Hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and we'll talk to you